exchanging, national security. We could have been accused of selling things to the Soviets. But in any case, Yechiel said to Professor Heschel, did you get a chance to read it, Professor Heschel? And he said, yes. And he said, and did you like it? And Professor Heschel said, I liked it very much.
So the sense of language, and how do you work on your language? For writers, reading other writers helps you to develop your own techniques, but it also gives you a sensitivity to language.
Sylvia Orenstein.
That was Sylvia Orenstein who was speaking. Sylvia taught Russian political science and literature for a long time, and then practiced law. She's also the wife of a very distinguished colleague, Zichrono Livracha, Yechiel Orenstein, and who I looked at as a model, as a rabbinic model. Avi has another story about Heschel, and then we're going to get into the text.
Yeah, so I knew Professor Heschel as I was a kid growing up, because I was part of the seminary community, and in shul he sat in the second row and my family sat in the third row, and our families knew each other socially and so on. But I didn't have the opportunity to take a class with him. He was teaching on a high level. When I was a sophomore in college, I was in the joint program between the seminary and Columbia. So one day, at the end of the day, it was really dark outside. I was heading over to my parents' house. They lived within a mile of the seminary, and I was going to join them for dinner. So Professor Heschel was at the bus stop waiting for the bus, and I didn't want to just pass him by, so I stopped, and we had a little chat. He asked me how my studies were going, and and if I liked my classes and so on. And most of my classes I liked. I was, however, taking a lab course in psychology. The psychology department at Columbia was very behavioralistically oriented. That is, they did a lot of experiments with rats and with pigeons. And I told him that I was somewhat ambivalent about that. And so he stopped to think. It was very clear that he was processing it. The wheels were turning. And then when he had digested it, he said to me, I can't imagine a greater insult to a human being than to be told that his behavior can be predicted from that of a rat. And that was Professor Heschel thinking on his feet.
So we're going to come back to the word ineffable later, but his first book, the poetry, is collected as Der Shem HaMeforash, Mensch. The God's ineffable name, the human. Translated, I have two translations. One is by Zalman Schachter Shlomi, and the other by Morton Leifman, The Ineffable Name of God, Man. So for Heschel, the human being was the expression of God in this world. The only symbol of God in Judaism is the human being. So in that little encounter, you also, if you look at it closely, can see that there's a bigger picture that Heschel is drawing on and commenting on from his own thinking and his own writing. So it's not just an encounter with a family friend who's a young man now at the bus stop. It's also something much more significant because it's indicative of a whole philosophy of life and a whole theology, and we'll come back to that. One of the most important things to know about Heschel is that he saw his work in many ways as reclaiming an approach to Judaism that he felt had been sidelined, marginalized. Judaism placed certainly beginning in the Middle Ages a high priority on rational thinking, on rational philosophy, and that continued. And certainly in the modern world, that was a very important part of modern Jewish thought and modern Jewish thought, a rejection of emotion and an emphasis on the mind. You get that, you hear that, for example, in cogito ergo sum, Descartes' words, I think, therefore I am. And Heschel had come from Warsaw to Berlin. Now, he wasn't the only person, the only Jew who did that. Joseph Ber Soloveitchik did that. There were other people who made that journey from Eastern Europe to Berlin, because Berlin was to use a mixed metaphor, the Mecca of intellectual life in Europe. But it was a challenge for Heschel, and he talked about this in a lecture that he gave to the Central Conference of American Rabbis in 1952, which was later printed in Toward an Understanding of Halakha in the yearbook of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. This is what he said. I came with great hunger to the University of Berlin to study philosophy. I looked for a system of thought, for the depth of spirit, for the meaning of existence. Erudite and profound scholars gave courses in logic, epistemology, aesthetics, ethics, and metaphysics. They opened the gates of the history of philosophy. I was exposed to the austere discipline of unremitting inquiry and self-criticism. Yet in spite of the intellectual power and honesty which I was privileged to witness, I became increasingly aware of the gulf that separated my views from those held at the university. I had come with a sense of anxiety. How can I rationally find a way where ultimate meaning lies, a way of significance? Why am I here at all, and what is my purpose? I did not even know how to phrase my concern. Remember that, because that'll come back. But to my teachers, that was a question unworthy of philosophical analysis. I realized my teachers were prisoners of a Greek-German way of thinking. They were fettered in categories which presupposed certain metaphysical assumptions which could never be proved. The questions I was moved by could not even be adequately phrased in categories of their thinking. My assumption, keep in mind the story that Avi told us, my assumption was man's dignity consists in having been created in the likeness of God. My question was, how must man, a being who is in the essence of the image of God, think, feel, and act. To them, religion was a feeling. To me, religion included the insights of the Torah, which is a vision of man from the point of view of God. They spoke of God from the point of view of man. To them, God was an idea, a postulate of reason. There's a little Kant there. They grant him the status of being a logical possibility. But to assume he had existence would have been a crime against epistemology. In those months in Berlin, I went through moments of profound bitterness. I felt very much alone with my own problems and anxieties. I walked alone in the evenings through the magnificent streets of Berlin. There were concerts, theaters, and lectures. And I was pondering one day whether to go to a new play or to a lecture about the theory of relativity. And suddenly, I noticed the sun had gone down. Evening had arrived. From what time may one recite the Shema in the evening? That's the beginning of the Mishnah. I had forgotten God. I had forgotten Sinai. I had forgotten that sunset was my business. And so I began to utter the words of the evening prayer. On that evening in Berlin, I was not in a mood to pray. My heart was heavy, my soul was sad. It was difficult for the words of prayer to break through the dark clouds of my inner life. But how would I dare not daven? How would I dare to miss the evening prayer? Out of Eimah, out of fear, again, quoting a little bit of play of words on the first Hebrew word of the Mishnah, me'ematai, out of Eimah, out of fear, do we read the Shema. There is in that statement something that's really important to understand Heschel in relationship to halakha, that the importance of halakha. That could have been said very much by Joseph Soloveitchik. The same sense of the law demands. But at the same time, there was something else going on for Heschel that was really important to understand. And I just need to find the page where I want to get us going. For Heschel, he picked up a methodology in Berlin and he brought it to his study of the prophets. The methodology is a philosophical methodology called phenomenology. It was really developed by Edmund Husserl. And phenomenology calls for an exact attention and analysis of the processes of an event, of a phenomenon, and also of the structure of how we think. Instead of studying something and saying, well, objectively, this is what it is, phenomenology said, let's do an objective study of what is usually considered to be subjective. That is, my own consciousness, the content of my experiences. So what you do in phenomenology is you bracket all the assumptions of causation, of history, and you ask instead, what is going on? What is the feeling? How is this being expressed? And phenomenology rejects the bias that is part of philosophy since Plato of the mind for what is lived experience. And in this, there's a lot of what you will pick up about existentialism. It's the same idea that Rosenzweig, the great Jewish philosopher, also had of rejecting the Western philosophical tradition in favor of something else. And phenomenology is rooted, therefore, in trying to find what is the intent, what is the feeling, what is the consciousness. And with that, Heschel begins to actually look at the prophet. So I'm going to pause for a minute. I'm going to put it onto screen share and call up a text. What I prepared for you and sent to you was Herschel Matt's, right, let me close that. Sorry, I have the wrong one. Was Herschel Matt's summary of quotations and things like that. What I did subsequently to sharing that with you is I went through what Herschel had put together. Herschel's son, you may be aware, has done a tremendous gift to the world by a major process of translating the Zohar, the book, the major book of Jewish mysticism. But Herschel was a rabbi actually in Troy, New York, just across the river from where I was in Albany, and then later in Princeton. And I want to take a look at some of what he says here, so you can follow me. And you'll hear in this book, The Prophets, was published in 1962 in English, but it was written in 1930. The degree was 1934 or 35, when it was finished, rather. The degree was awarded in 1938. So you may hear some of the words in English that echo other things that Heschel wrote. But let's take a look here, the second paragraph. The prophets remind us of the moral state of the people. If you read the books of the prophets, they are constantly criticizing the people of Israel. And they criticize all of the people, even though, as Heschel writes here, few are guilty, but all are responsible. If we admit that the individual is in some measure conditioned or affected by the spirit of society, an individual's crime discloses society's corruption. In a community not indifferent to suffering, uncompromisingly impatient with cruelty and falsehood, continually concerned for God and every man, crime would be infrequent rather than common. There's a little bit of moralism and particular moral perspective on sociology. But I want to go to the last lines. The prophet is carried away by a demand of God, carried away by the challenge, the demand to straighten out man's ways. The prophet is strange, one-sided, an unbearable extremist. While others may suffer from the terror of cosmic aloneness, again, that's an existential idea, the prophet instead is overwhelmed by the grandeur of divine presence, incapable of isolating the world. And now, a key idea, there is an interaction between man and God, which to disregard is an act of insolence. Isolation is a fairy tale. So he goes on to say the prophet's word is a scream in the night. The prophet can't hold himself back, and yet others will predict peace and prosperity, offering cheerful words, adding strength to self-reliance, while the prophet predicts disaster, pestilence, agony, and distortions. Yes, people do need exhortations to courage, endurance, confidence, fighting spirit, but Yirmiyahu proclaims you're about to die if you don't have a change of heart. Now, Heschel in the late 1940s, early 1950s, was aware of a very popular work in English that was written by a rabbi and I've just gone blank on the name, that emphasized the idea of how good life is. And Heschel was very critical of that idea, and that comes out of his sense of the prophets. Now, we get to, right. I want to go to here. And this is an idea that he begins to develop, and you're going to see important words in this paragraph. He develops an idea of pathos. And the idea that the divine and the human, there's a sympathy that goes on. But he says it is both a paradox and a mystery. We're going to come back to these words of paradox and mystery over and over again. Why should the one who created all be affected by what a tiny particle of his creation fails or does? Pathos is a disclosure of divine concern and a concealment of power. The idea of concealment of power is that God cares and therefore has rachamim, has compassion. And the act of compassion is a concealment of power. So you may think that the human is majesty, grandeur, omnipotence, and perfection. A first cause. This is Aristotle and almost all those who followed him in medieval philosophy. So why should the human being be involved in the affairs of human existence? But this pathos is the key to prophecy. And here he comes again to an idea that will become critical not only to his study of prophecy, but much later to what we would call constructive theology, the theology that he develops. God is involved in the life of man. There is an interweaving of the divine and the affairs of the nation. It's not merely the 10 recommendations, but the divine mitzvot express divine concern, which is of personal importance to God. So, again, he says, if you study the prophets deeply, he is not interested in the historical events that surround the prophets. He is not interested in the literary structure of the verses. He is not interested in the the ancient Near Eastern correlated words from Hebrew to Akkadian or Ugaritic or anything else. The fundamental experience is a fellowship with the feelings of God, a sympathy with the divine pathos of caring, a communion with the divine consciousness. The typical prophetic state of mind is being taken up into the heart of the divine pathos. So what you have here is this idea that there's something going on, and Heschel is trying to analyze what is going on in the mind and heart of the prophet. That's what is this phenomenological method. It is not an attraction to the divine being. It's not a love in that sense, but it is the assimilation to the emotional life of the divine. And here he develops a little bit of an idea that will later come back in his studies of mysticism. It is an assimilation of function, not of being. The prophet doesn't want to become one with God. The prophet remains separate from God, but shares something with God. The prophet hears God's voice and feels the divine heart and tries to impart the pathos of the message together with its logos. What is logos there? Logos means its meaning. It's not just it wants the feeling along with the content. Now, that's very interesting because the criticism that Maimonides has, or the limitation Maimonides has, is Maimonides says that the poet, the prophet is trying to appeal to the rhetorical devices. And what Heschel is saying is, no, there's more than just rhetoric here. Pathos, he says, is an act formed with intention, the result of decision and determination. So there's a sense, and you can hear this kind of existentialism there, decision, determination. It's not just, what you're given. It's the idea of trying to do something. And what he's saying here is that the divine pathos is not an absolute force which exists regardless of man. It is a reaction to human history. Martin Buber talks about how the prophet speaks to individual situations, not to eternal verities. And as a consequence of all of that passion, as a consequence, the prophets, what they say has power because they are linking themselves in some way to the emotional life of God. Now, why is that such an interesting idea? Because the whole emphasis in medieval thought, medieval philosophical thought, is that to move away from the idea of the biblical model of God getting involved and God changing and God caring, because that doesn't conform to the Aristotelian model that says if the divine is perfect, then God can't react to anything, because by reacting, God changes. And change, by definition, is not perfection. So Heschel doesn't talk very much here about that, but it's in the background when he says, for philosophers, it's the unmoved mover. Heschel's student, Fritz Rothschild, who's also my teacher, went and said that for Heschel, God is the most moved mover. I'm going to stop sharing, come back to our whole group. There's a lot of us online, and to ask about your thoughts about this idea of divine pathos. You can put your hand up if you want. Judy.
Well, two things. One is, I think it's very interesting that he makes this leap to talk about God having an emotional life. So I'd love to hear more from you about that. But the other question that I have is certainly in the thing that we saw last week, many people called Heschel a prophet. Given his understanding of what a prophet was he comfortable with that?
It's interesting. On more than one occasion, Heschel referred to Martin Luther King as a prophet, and King referred to Heschel as a prophet. I remember writing something for a student of Heschel's, my teacher Byron Sherwin, and I quoted Simon and Garfunkel, "The words of the prophet are written on the subway walls." And he scribbled all over that, really reacted to it. And I think that there is a sense sometimes that the word can be used in a colloquial way. But Heschel did say something very interesting. He wrote a major paper in Hebrew that was translated to English in the early 1940s. Did Maimonides believe that he had reached the state of prophecy? What he was trying to say, and he does this in other works as well, is that there was a tradition that was carried on by Jewish thinkers, more on the mystical side, but also on the philosophical side, that human beings could aspire to more than just an intellectual life. David Blumenthal, who's emeritus at Emory, called attention in Maimonides to what he called philosophical contemplation, which was intended to go beyond the idea of the rational. That idea has been picked up a little bit. And Moshe Idel of Hebrew U, who also is at the Hartman Institute, Idel writes that Heschel's idea of prophecy in some way having an afterlife was exceptionally important, and it was ignored by a lot of people. Idel talks about Avraham Abulafia and what he calls prophetic mysticism. So there's something out there. I don't know whether he would have agreed with the idea that he was a prophet, but I think he would have certainly said that there is the possibility, the ongoing possibility or yearning on some level to be in a relationship with God where you actually feel the divine presence and speak on behalf of God. And I would say you have to be careful with that. Martin Buber said, how do you know that it's God who's speaking or the monkeys? So you have to be really, really careful about that. Mariana, quickly. Mariana, you wanted to say something? Okay, I'm going to Friedel. Friedel.
when I hear the word pathos, I am struck with a sense of as I'm struck with a sense that it's the wrong word. I feel that God has empathy for us, and that speaks to an idea of a personal God. I think that from what I've read in Heschel, mostly the monograph Shabbat, but I get the sense that a personal God is what he is referring to, what he is talking about, and what so many people deny. A personal God doesn't have to be imperfect for you to have a relationship with God. And I wanted to share it. I think that God has empathy for each of us. And I felt I learned it from Heschel, but perhaps not.
So he stays away from the word empathy. And I think it's because it had certain psychological overtones. And he writes an afterword in the book in his volume on prophecy, on the prophets. You see where it's a multi-page thing, a note on the meaning of pathos. The sense in which the word pathos is employed differs from the meaning most frequently encountered in common usage. And then he goes on to discuss it in terms of Greek terminology, and in terms of modern philosophy, 19th century philosophy, literature, Shakespeare, but he's trying to say the prophet is on some level living with God, not being part of God, but living with God. I just want to remind people that some people are posting things in the chat. Rabbi Kogan noted that people started referring to him as a prophet, which may be an imprecise way of expressing appreciation, rather than a direct comment, rather than a technical term. I also want to remind you, mute yourselves unless you're called upon. Sheila, please.
Well, I'm a complete neophyte in this, so what I'm going to say is probably chutzpah, but I feel that it would have helped to have placed the prophetic inspiration chapter that you gave us before this talk about Matt, because it was the only thing that helped me understand what you were saying now when you were talking about this article from Matt, this piece from Matt. I would have preferred to have started with the prophetic inspiration, which would have then said a lot more when looking at Matt. That's my feeling, just my feeling.
Okay, I accept that. That's why I reorganized it for myself, because I thought that I wanted to not only approach it historically in terms of his own thinking, but I think that the way he understood the prophet plays a big role in all his subsequent work, even though he doesn't translate it till 1962, which is interesting in and of itself. Okay, I want to go on to paradox and polarity. I'm going to go back to screen sharing and hopefully get it right. No, I don't want that. Wait, sorry. Okay, I'll get us there. I hope I got it. Yes.
There you go.
Okay. Heschel's very concerned with this idea that people are trying to come to like a specific conclusion. It's like a one-way street. And he believed, and this in some ways comes out of Hegelian philosophy, the thesis and an antithesis, that paradox is essential. And in philosophy and in religion, and its source is in the human being. He gives an example. Although the Shekhinah, the presence of God, is everywhere, the experience of the Shekhinah is always somewhere, because we live in a particular place in space. And now notice what he's going to set up. All these, I'll call them polarities. Living truth is the blending of the universal and the individual, of idea and understanding, of distance and intimacy, of the ineffable, which we'll come to a little bit later, and the expressible, the timeless and the temporal, body and soul, time and space. So rather than, and this is a reaction to the materialism of 18th and 19th century modern thought. That it's not only the mind. It's not only a particular direct approach, but rather there's an oscillation that is going on. Now, he may be affected, even though Heschel disagreed strongly with the non-theism
Maybe I'll come
of
in.
Einstein. Please mute yourself. He disagreed with the non-theism of Einstein, but he may have been affected by the idea, by Einstein's idea, that time and space are in a very complex reality. And there is a certain, there are changes that go on. So it's not only time, it's not only space, but they're in a relationship. He's going to explain now that Jewish thinking and living, whoever is talking, please mute yourself.
We're getting up early for us. Now to see an exclusive this morning.
I am going to, can I mute everyone?
Yes,
You can, please.
Is there a threat to
Trying to
American
find how I do that.
free man? Okay, you see it doesn't do that.
People in Ukraine are certainly suffering, but maybe that's.
At the bottom, you can mute, Rabbi. Bottom. of
I
the-
can, it says mute, but I
Yes,
don't see that I can mute everybody.
you can, and then unmute yourself.
Doesn't say that here. Okay, something else I need to learn. Look at how he sees this. There's a dialect, again, that's a bit of Hegel, containing opposite or contrasted properties. The terms are opposite to one another and exemplify a polarity which lies at the very heart of Judaism, of mitzvah and sin, of kavanah and deed, of regularity and spontaneity, of uniformity and individuality, of halakha and agadah, of law and inwardness, of love and fear, of understanding and obedience, of joy and discipline, of the good and evil yetzer, the drive, of time and eternity, of this world and the world to come, of revelation and response, of insight and information, of empathy and self-expression, of creed and faith, of the word and that which is beyond word, of man's quest for God and God in search of man. So you have all of these polarities that he's saying you can't comprehend something in just one way. And therefore, because you need both, you are inherently in a paradox. Let me go to the idea of kavanah and deed, of regularity and spontaneity. So you're supposed to have kavanah, intention, to do mitzvot. But the rabbis say that if you do the deed, even without the kavanah, it's still effective. I'm going to give you a secular example. When I stop at a red light, I could have all the intention that what I'm doing is I'm contributing to public safety and I'm helping the people who want to cross the street and all of that, but it doesn't really matter. What matters is that I stop. The same thing is true here in regularity and spontaneity. Ideally, when I pray, I bring something fresh to it all the time. But, as we all know, the regularity of prayer can be deadening to that. So he's trying to show that these things are going on all the time. Take this world and the world to come. There's an observation in Pirkei Avot that the whole world is like a vestibule to the world to come. Well, that would mean like the world to come is the real thing. And yet there's another quote in Pirkei Avot that says, great is 1 hour in this world more than the world to come. So there is something in these polarities. And he was very aware that some of the scholarship about rabbinic literature, ranging from Schechter and others, really sought to develop a systematic theology. Lay it all out and minimize the contradictions. And there was somebody who taught at the seminary for many years, Max Kedushin, who said that there is an organic quality to rabbinic thought that works off of certain key phrases, or he called them value concepts. Heschel doesn't take the same position that Kedushin did, but what he is trying to say is that you can't bring it to systematization. Now, many years later, or I won't say many years later, one of Heschel's secretary students was Jack Neusner. And Neusner was very critical of the earlier generation of rabbinic scholars who sought to put things into a systematic theology. And he may have gotten that idea from Heschel. I can't be sure of that. Here he goes into some other ways that God is related to the world. You know, on Rosh Hashanah, we speak of God's justice. but on Yom Kippur of God's mercy. We speak of God being providential and caring, and yet also of God concealing the divine presence. We tell people that you serve God and there is a reward, there's a schar. At the same time, we say, don't be like the servant who serves in order to get a reward. Taken abstractly, he says, all these terms seem to be mutually exclusive. But in actual rising, I'm not sure if that's the correct term, they involve each other, and you shouldn't try to separate them. So many times you will hear rabbis tell you, this is what Judaism teaches. And I tried very hard to say, doesn't work that way. That you can talk about a particular teaching and what does it try to convey. But Judaism as a whole is like a multi-lane highway. And there are different speeds and there are on-ramps and off-ramps. And it's hard to say that Judaism teaches only this. Now notice what he says here. Because the principles may be pulling in different directions, equilibrium can only be maintained if both are of equal force. But that condition is hard to attain. And so polarity, tension, contrast, contradiction characterize all of reality. There is only one being, he says, who doesn't have that polarity, and I'm not sure whether he's correct. There's a polarity in everything except God. For all tension ends in God, who is beyond all dichotomies. I'm going to come back to the screen, turn off the screen sharing, so we can have a little bit of discussion. And Jake Brooks wants to know whether Heschel ever delved into process theology or philosophy. He certainly knew the work of Whitehead. And there are people who believe that an element of Heschel related to process philosophy. But I think not, primarily because process philosophy has this idea of what I'll call an evolving God. Not involving, but evolving. Mordechai Kaplan's theology is closer to process theology and to John Dewey and others in terms of practical things and in terms of sociology. But Heschel, I think, wanted to kind of pick up pieces of this idea that God is not static, but he didn't want to go all the way into saying that God is always an evolving being. It's the polarities that are going back and forth. It's not that God is only moving in this direction. In the participants tab, I can manually mute everyone. Well, I'm not going to do that, but thank you. But in any case, if you muted yourself, thank you. Somebody else says it's through the participants panel. Well, maybe. I don't know. Anyway, so let's take a minute for you to react to this idea of polarity and paradox. Do you find that works for you? Do you find that in your own previous studies of Judaism that makes sense? Or do you think Heschel's overdoing it for literary effect? Dot, you had a question or a comment?
Question. I'm having some difficulty wrapping my head around the non-systematic nature of a very systematic set of polarized ideas. And
I have to try to wrap my head around what you said.
well, it seems to me that the moment one speaks of polarity, it becomes a very, and I might be really missing something here, but when one speaks of polarity with these absolute examples, it doesn't leave space for nuance and gradation, and it's very linear. For me, it's a very linear thing, and it may be that it's a difference of time as well. The dimensionality of universes doesn't make sense to me. I can't align because it's very fixed and temporal.
Let me try to help you a little bit, I hope.
Thank you.
I don't think he's saying it's either or, and that it's a binary model. I think that what he's saying is that you're constantly in this tension, and while in theory you always like to be at the 50%, that point where it's all in balance, but it's not. And he recognizes that. So that allows for what you're calling the nuance, because he's expressing the sense that in that tension is where we wind up living and where divinity is. Was that helpful?
I will sit with that. Maybe it's the temporal piece that is problematic for me. But thank you. I will sit with these pieces.
Okay, I just want to comment. Rabbi Kogan said, I find Heschel's thought pattern to be more spiral than linear. He often goes around something. It's like he's circling. Many years ago, one of his students, Sam Dresner, and I were walking together, and I was trying to think out an idea, and he said, "Oh, you're very Heschelian." Now, he was someone who was Heschel's real student, and he said, "Oh, you think like Heschel. You keep going around and around and around until you eventually get to it, but you don't get to it like in a direct way." So I don't know whether that was a compliment or not. And Susan Lilker says that there is polarity in Musar teaching as well. And I think that that's correct. It's not that Heschel was, somebody once said that the ideal Jewish book would be a book, and Michael Marmer writes this at one point, the ideal Jewish book would only be quotations. And Heschel himself does a lot of quoting or paraphrasing. So he said once, "I'm not so original, I just am quoting everybody." But it was the way he put it together that made it original, and the quality of his language. One of his family members was a teacher and colleague of mine, and said that he downplayed Heschel. He said Heschel is really just Yiddish stained glass windows. And I told him I thought he was wrong. I thought he didn't really get it right. Shirley Brazer.
In that last reading, it talked about the polarities. And then I thought the last sentence said that God is beyond that. So I think there's the two levels of reality that he said very clearly. On the human level, everything exists in opposites. But when you go at the God level, there's total unity. You go beyond the opposites.
So I like that because clearly I think Heschel is also on some level building on the idea that exists in Kabbalah of the Alma de Preda, the world of separation. That is, our world is the world of separation, but that ultimately the divine is the world of unification. So I think you may have something there. Judy?
I want to offer a possibly idiotic visual, which to me meant that these things do go together. I mean, what could be more Jewish than tension, right? I mean, it seems
Anxiety.
Anxiety also. So what I was thinking about was, you know, those things that you use to hold onto a plate to be able to hang it on a wall, and there's hooks on either side and there's a spring in the middle. So you've got a hook over here and you've got a hook over here, but those hooks don't work unless there's a pull between them, unless there's that tension between them, and that's what holds on to the plate. That's what allows you to look at the idea. And for me, to see all that whole list of things in opposition to one another felt like the kind of, that this was sort of the embodiment of those. You can only hold on to that idea if you've got hooks on both sides and a tension between them.
A
Maybe
nice
it's stupid. Does that work?
visual image that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Adi or Adi.
Adi's fine. I've heard the quote, the mind is what the brain does. And it kind of, you know, it brought to mind, you know, hearing you speak about this tension, this notion that, like, you know, part of this subjective experience might be kind of you know, internal almost conflict between the limbic system and the cortex. Where we have, in the limbic system, we have kind of, you know, desires, emotions, that type of thing. And then in the cortex is kind of a more rational, abstract notion. So I don't know if that's, you know, that's applicable here or worthwhile mentioning.
I don't know if that's apropos exactly, but, you know, clearly the way we think with two hemispheres is also this back and forth. Someone once taught me that we remember names with one hemisphere and we remember faces with the other. And the goal is to try to make sure when we're thinking and meeting somebody to get the facial image and the name pulling together somehow. So maybe the limbic and the cambrial is another way of expressing that. Thank you. Lynn, and then we're going to go on.
Well, I appreciate Judy's imaging, because really the tension is from the confusion of being able to relate to both sides of the paradox. And I can recognize myself in many of those dualities, because nothing is set in stone in life, as humans as we are. I guess we evolve and change and add what we learn and sort of mature in some directions. But the anxiety may be a key for me, and bringing as reassurance to know that the paradox is just the way human life is. And it's reassuring to know that, well, Hashem is one, the divine is one, whatever that means for each of us humans. it's a point of reference for deep consciousness to maybe at one moment or another resolve these anxieties.
Yeah, I don't think that Heschel was exposed to a lot of Buddhist thought. He may have been tangentially aware, but the rise of awareness of Buddhist thought is really toward the end of his life. But there's no question that that Buddhism is another example of a religious tradition that places a lot of emphasis on kind of paradox and breaking your head, you know, not, so that you can't wrap your head around something completely. I want to take us to another approach, another key idea rather. If I can find it here, hold on, there it is. And that is the idea of theology and depth theology. I'm going to hopefully pull it up in the screen share. There. Great. So Heschel is very aware that he was not focused on this idea of systematic theology, which was very German, was not focused on the idea of systematic theology, which was very medieval philosophical. Think for a moment about the Maimonidean principles of faith. He's trying to elicit something else. And he develops a terminology for it, where he says there's a difference between theology and depth theology. And we're going to understand that as we go forward. Theology is about content, the content of believing, or what you are supposed to believe. But depth theology is the act of believing. It's the actual believing. If I could put it another way, Heschel was not Martin Buber, but Buber is also trying to move away from this I-it objectivity to an I-thou relational. So he says the purpose of depth theology is to explore the substratum out of which belief arises. So there's something that goes on, he would say, that leads us to a feeling. Go back, remember to this phenomenology model. If you're talking, please yourself. That there's something else going on. And this is an idea that he's going to explore later when we get to the next section. There are things that precede articulation. Remember, he said, when he was talking about Berlin, he said, I couldn't really articulate what was bothering me in the presentations of philosophy. There's something that you can't yet articulate. There may be even something you can't define, but there is something else. And so he says, here's how he begins to articulate, and notice how he sets up the polarities. Theology speaks for the people, depth theology speaks for the individual. So individuals don't adhere to, you know, these are the 13 principles and we believe it exactly this way. Mark Shapiro has done a lot of work to show that some very great Orthodox rabbi write or say, if you're talking, please check, your mute.
You still have something? Yeah, I'm watching a lecture here.
Jerry, can you just mute yourself, please?
I'm leaving.
Okay.
You have to calm it down because they can't see you.
Jerry, all you have to do is mute yourself.
Okay.
Thank you. So you can have the principles of faith, but the way you're going to understand it and feel it depends on how you're feeling. Depends on what your something beyond the list. Theology strives for communication because you want to be able to articulate what are the principles, or universality because it's going to apply to everyone. That's very Kantian. But depth theology, which is more existential, is individual, and it strives for insight and uniqueness. It's much more individual. Heschel was married to a musician, to a pianist. They often listened to music at home. One of my teachers at Northwestern, Manfred Vogel, Zichrono Livracha, played violin, and he said that occasionally they would set up a small quartet at the Heschel's home. Theology is like sculpture in the sense that it's fixed. Depth theology, like music, that it's flowing. Theology is in the books. What you read, what you articulate clearly. Depth theology in the heart. Theology is doctrine, the latter an event. Remember, the prophet speaks not about doctrine, but about a specificity. And knowing full well what happened in Christianity, theologies divide us. Depth theology unites us. This is an idea that's really important because this also will come back when he deals with interfaith relations. Because we may have different theologies. We don't believe the same thing. Soloveitchik said that because of that, we can't actually engage in theological dialogue with other religions. And Heschel said, yes, you can, because you're not only talking about theology, which is the way you articulate it on the surface, you're also talking about what gives rise to how you believe. And again, you can sense in this a little bit of the ideas or the passion that came from the prophetic piece. Depth theology seeks to meet the person in moments in which the whole person is involved, that are affected by all a person thinks, feels, and acts, when you're confronting ultimate reality. It's those deep moments. Now, if you've ever had these experiences, it doesn't happen often. And Heschel, in that sense, is Maimonidean, and Maimonides articulates this idea that you only get this flash, this momentary insight, this momentary feeling. And he would say, or Heschel then says, that's why you need dogmas, because we can't get there all the time. You want to save these moments for functional living. Then he uses this beautiful analogy to bees and amber. Dogmas are the amber in which bees once alive are embalmed. But remember amber, they are capable of being electrified when they are exposed properly. Something can turn it back on. So you may have a creed, and then something will click. And it's no longer just a creed, it's a passion. But notice, he says, the insights of depth theology are vague. Again, you can't get it clear. They defy formulation and expression. So theology establishes the doctrines, gives it coherence, finds the words that are necessary. But theology becomes a substitute. It's a secondary thing. It's a substitute for insight. It's informative. It doesn't evoke. If you take a moment and you look at the difference between two Hebrew piyutim that you all know, you probably have all seen or read Yigdal, which is Maimonides' 13 Principles of Faith, set to a poetic meter. You have probably also seen and read and sung Adon Olam. Look at those two carefully at some point, because Yigdal is much more theology, and Adon Olam is much more feeling. It's much more something's going on, a relationship. So he says depth, here's the danger though. The danger is that depth theology can become subjectivism. And so you need to have something that will be crystallized and takes the form of theology, of doctrine, of principle. But the danger, here he's setting up now, again, a polarity. Crystallization can result in petrification. So you want to keep alive the polarity of doctrine and insight, dogma and faith, ritual response, institution and individual. If you can do that, then in that back and forth, something creative comes. And by the way, the idea of that back and forth, in Kabbalah, it's called Ratzo V'Shov. It takes its terminology from Ezekiel, who sees the angels going back and forth, running back and forth. And in Kabbalah, you have this idea that divinity isn't static. It's going back and forth between different elements of the divine. I'm going to go very quickly. Where did it go? I'm going to go very quickly to another idea, and I'm going to do it fast. And he says, mystery. There is no Jewish theologian of the 20th century or 100 years before that uses the word mystery as much as Heschel does. Edel thinks that there's something that Heschel is sort of picking up from the terminology of the Catholic Church. I'm not so sure. The Catholics do talk a lot about the mystery of how the bread, the wafer becomes the body, transubstantiation. But I don't know that he's really picking up on this. But the idea that there's something out there that we cannot account for. And things happen to us and we feel things, and they're anchored in mystery, and we can't identify it all. Remember, there's a difference between sound and signal. You hear a lot of sounds, but what's the signal in the midst of them? We can solve things, and yet we all know that our minds are like black boxes. And as a consequence, the mystery of our existence is beyond and away from us. We're there, and yet the fate of the world depends on it. What is mystery? It's what you experience in an exceptional moment. But it's not, and this is very important, it's not only for the elite. It's a dimension of all existence. It can be experienced anywhere, anytime, and by anyone. It's not only when we're reaching like the apex of our thought, but here we may face it at every turn, because everything holds the great secret. There's a poet who says, you know, it's to see the miracle in the unfolding of a flower. There's something, if you devote time to just concentrating on something, then this mindfulness makes you deeply aware of things. I remember someone who was dealing with cancer and was terminally ill, and he said, I go to the back and I stare for an hour or two at a leaf, at the wrinkles, at the drops of water sometimes, and I focus on that. And Heschel says, I apprehend it, but you don't necessarily comprehend it. So here again is music. Again, his wife was a poet. How would we know of the mystery if not of our sense of the ineffable? Remember that word that came up before? And that is the Shem HaMeforash, the ineffable name of God. It's not to be articulated, but we can sense it. We can be aware of it. It's there, and it is not irrational. It's not the residue of knowledge. We come to a point where it's there. Some people sense this at distant intervals in extraordinary events, and others in ordinary events. It is not an esoteric mystical faculty, but it is something with which all people are endowed. And that's an important idea for him. And now he'll bring in a term, the awareness of this radical amazement. That's a term we'll come back to. It is as significant as the philosophical principles of contradiction or of sufficient reason. And I want to take you now just to one other thing. And this is a very important idea. He says you don't necessarily define it or describe it, but sometimes the most important things, you point to it. It's indicative, it's suggestive. It's there. Do you see it? I'm feeling this, but you can't really put your finger on it. But you can give a kind of direction. And that's what he's interested in doing. And if you can get there, then beyond mystery is meaning, not plain meaning, not only mystery, but they're in a dialogue. Again, the destiny of a human being is to articulate what's concealed, and the divine is disclosed in the human. Heschel will keep coming back with the prophets and his own theology, comes back to the idea of God in relationship to the human being. So we didn't have a chance to talk about these last two things. I'm going to ask if you have a question, write it down, and we'll begin next week with that because I'm already 10 minutes over. Next week, we're going to be looking at where did I put it? Got papers here, more papers than I want to have hanging out. Whatever is on the syllabus, that's what we're going to be looking at. We're going to be drawing mostly again from what Heschel Matt put together, but I will reorganize it. And if you have a chance and can read some of the other stuff or watch some of the films, I think you'll find it really meaningful. As we go along, you're going to begin to see that there are certain ideas that cohere. Sherry, last question before we finish up. You have to unmute.
I know, just took me a little bit of time. First of all, I want to thank you. I'm not a member of your congregation. I found out about you from a JTS Scholar Stream talk that I went to this morning. Ari Ackerman, and one of the participants there mentioned this class. I cannot remember who it was, but if they are there, I want to thank them. And second, I grew up in Metuchen, New Jersey, and you did not mention it, but Rabbi Heschel Matt was my rabbi. He was my rabbi my whole life until I went to high school, and very dear to me.
And his sons are very dear to me.
Right. Johnny was a year older than I am, so, and I was a part of anyway, it was very nice to be a part of this. Thank you very much.
I'm very glad. And one of the things that you could see from what Sylvia said and what Avi said, and now Sherry, all of these little personal connections actually make a tremendous amount of difference. It's not all abstract thought.
And I do want to add as well that my sister is Lisa Schulman, who is very good friends with Debbie Orenstein, who is Sylvia's daughter. I'm 10 years older, so I only knew Debbie sort of as a babysitter kind of person.
There we have it. It's all there. To sense the transcendent in the very small flower, the grain of sand. Thank you very much, and we'll be back next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks, Rabbi. Good night.
It's all recorded. Eventually, it'll all be sent out. The only part that I forgot to do is I didn't get the first part of Sylvia's story. So Sylvia, I found Yechiel wrote it. And I'll put it out there. Okay? Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.